must stay quiet.
I hope this is over soon.
A city disappears. In an instant, its lights vanish, its streets swallowed by shadow. No neon signs, no glowing windows, not even the faint spark of a cigarette. This was the reality for millions of civilians during World War II. Every night across London, Berlin, Warsaw, and countless towns in between, the world went dark not by choice, but by command. The blackout was a weapon, a shield, and a prison all at once. Civilians weren't soldiers, yet their survival depended on silence and darkness. A single slip of curtain left open, a lamp too bright could turn a neighborhood into a target. For the first time, war wasn't fought only on the battlefield. It crept into kitchens, bedrooms, and living rooms, forcing ordinary families to fight not with guns, but with patience, discipline, and fear. In those hours of darkness, the home front became a battlefield of its own. The blackout rules were blunt and uncompromising. No light could escape into the night. Governments across Europe enforced it with strict precision. Street lamps were switched off, traffic lights extinguished, and headlights on cars reduced to narrow slits. Families draped windows with thick curtains, nailed boards over glass, and sealed cracks with tape and paint. Even a match struck too close to a window could draw a reprimand or fine. Patrols of wardens roamed the streets, knocking on doors and scolding anyone careless enough to let a glow slip through. The stakes were brutally simple. A visible street, a lit house, could guide enemy bombers to their mark. Now, darkness became the only defense. Yet while the blackout protected against attack from above, it introduced new dangers on the ground. Streets once familiar became traps, and accidents quickly rose to alarming levels. The blackout saved lives, but it also quietly claimed them. London was among the first cities to feel the weight of this darkness. On September 1st, 1939, before a single bomb had struck, the lights of the capital were extinguished. Overnight, one of the world's busiest cities became unrecognizable. Theaters closed their doors, businesses struggled to adapt, and nightlife collapsed. Commuters stumbled their way home in pitch black, and drivers risked collision at every corner. Yet Londoners understood. They had seen the devastation in Guernica and Warsaw, and they knew the sky above their city would soon roar with enemy bombers. For them, the blackout wasn't a nuisance. It was survival. Still, the transformation was haunting. What had been a vibrant metropolis by day became eerie and ghost-like by night, its silence broken only by sirens and the distant hum of aircraft. The blackout wasn't just a safety measure. It was a daily reminder that war had arrived on their doorstep. Inside homes, families carried out their own nightly rituals of defense. Curtains were checked twice, sometimes 3 times, to make sure no sliver of light escaped. Windows were painted black or covered in layers of newspaper, pinned and taped until nothing shone through. Parents drilled their children, no peeking, no careless gestures near the glass, no striking matches without warning. Even cigarettes smoked too close to a door could betray a household. These rituals bred discipline, but also unease. Children learned to treat bedtime like a battle, whispering stories or singing quietly to drown the silence. For many families, this became the rhythm of war. Not gunfire, not uniforms, but the daily sealing of their homes against the night. It was an invisible war fought with fabric and tape, and it carried the same weight as any soldier's trench line. The blackout turned every home into a fortress of shadows. But the blackout carried a deadly irony. The very darkness meant to protect people from bombs also killed them in staggering numbers. With no streetlights, accidents became inevitable. Pedestrians fell into canals, cyclists vanished into ditches, and motorists collided on narrow streets they could barely see. Hospitals quietly recorded rising casualties from falls, crashes, and missteps. In some months, more civilians died from accidents caused by the blackout than from enemy bombs themselves. Governments responded with makeshift solutions, reflective armbands, glowing buttons, and white-painted curbs to mark dangerous edges. But visibility was poor, and tragedies continued. The blackout revealed a cruel truth. Survival was never guaranteed. Every evening, families not only feared the bombers overhead, but also the silent hazards waiting in the streets below. It was a new kind of danger, one that made civilians realize the war would claim lives in ways they had never imagined. The psychological burden was just as heavy. Darkness breeds uncertainty, and uncertainty breeds fear. Families huddled together, whispering stories or playing games, trying to distract themselves from the oppressive silence outside. Every distant hum of an aircraft, every echoing footstep in the street, set nerves on edge. Children woke in tears, convinced the shadows hid intruders or fire. Adults endured sleepless nights, unable to shake the thought that any moment might bring an air raid. The blackout blurred the line between safety and suffocation. It was meant to shield people from bombs, but it also reminded them night after night that they were vulnerable. Some found comfort in prayer, others in small routines, but many lived under a constant weight of dread. For those civilians, the blackout wasn't just physical lit, was psychological warfare, a nightly battle of the mind as much as of survival. Yet even in darkness, communities found ways to cope. Churches organized dimly lit gatherings where neighbors sang hymns or shared food. Families invented new games to entertain restless children. Musicians played in hidden rooms, their notes softened to keep from reaching the street. In some neighborhoods, the blackout even created unexpected intimacy. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now leaned on each other for support, trading candles, food, or simply company in the long hours of night. Darkness, though frightening, sometimes brought people closer. It forged bonds born from necessity as communities faced the same invisible enemy together. Resilience became a weapon. The blackout tested patience, but it also inspired creativity and solidarity. In the absence of light, people discovered that survival wasn't only about protection from bombs, it was also about finding strength in one another and in the fragile warmth of shared humanity. Not everyone, however, accepted the blackout without complaint. Some civilians grew resentful of its strict rules, frustrated at yet another intrusion into daily life. Blackout wardens became both guardians and nuisances, their knocks on doors sparking irritation. Mistakes happened, often curtains left ajar, lamps forgotten, or cigarettes lit too close to a window. Sometimes it was rebellion, other times fatigue. In Berlin and other cities, whispers spread of households ignoring orders, leaving faint lights on in defiance. But risks were too great for widespread resistance. Neighbors often reported neighbors fearing that carelessness might doom an entire block. The blackout became a test not only of survival but of trust. It revealed the tension between personal freedom and collective safety, a fragile balance that wartime demanded. In that darkness, communities were forced to decide: endure the suffocating rules together or risk the wrath of bombs and each other. In occupied cities, the blackout carried an even harsher weight. In Warsaw, Paris, and across much of Europe, families lived under two shadows: the bombs above and the soldiers in their streets. Blackout rules were enforced not just with fines, but with threats of imprisonment or worse. For civilians stripped of freedom, the enforced darkness deepened their sense of oppression, yet some turned it into opportunity. Resistance fighters moved quietly under cover of black, delivering pamphlets, passing messages, or hiding weapons. But the risks were enormous. Flicker of light, the sound of hurried footsteps, could bring not only enemy planes, but enemy patrols. For many, the blackout was a double-edged sword, a symbol of helplessness, but also a shield for acts of defiance. In those shadows, courage took root. The very darkness designed to control people also gave them space to resist. By the time the Blitz struck London in 1940, civilians were already trained by months of blackout discipline. Yet the reality of bombs falling in total darkness was unlike anything they had imagined. Without light, people often couldn't tell where destruction was unfolding. Fires roared unseen until smoke drifted through the night. Streets filled with chaos as families stumbled toward shelters, tripping over unseen steps, colliding with others in panic. The blackout, meant to protect, also amplified confusion and fear, and still, civilians clung to it. Covering their windows, dimming their homes, they felt they were fighting back in the only way they could, by denying the enemy their targets. It was a fragile illusion of control, but one they desperately needed. For in those nights of fire and ash, the blackout was both their prison and their armor, shaping how they endured the storm from above. Shelters became the second stage of blackout life. When sirens wailed, Families left their darkened homes and crowded into basements, cellars, or communal shelters dug beneath streets. In Britain, the London Underground transformed into a nightly refuge, with entire families carrying blankets and food down into the tunnels. There, among the smell of damp stone and dust, thousands tried to sleep while bombs thundered above. The blackout made the shelters even more vital. Without lights outside, people stumbled blindly through the streets, guided only by wardens or the sound of neighbors' voices. Children were carried half asleep, clutching toys as their parents hurried them along. In those shelters, humanity was reduced to its simplest form: waiting, surviving, enduring. The darkness above merged with the darkness below, reminding civilians that their lives were suspended between fear and resilience. For many, these nights underground defined their memory of the war more than the daylight ever did. The blackout also reshaped daily routines. People planned meals, work, and travel around the coming night. Shoppers hurried home before sunset, and factory workers staggered shifts to avoid being caught in the dark streets. Entertainment suffered too. Cinemas and theaters, once vibrant centers of city life, struggled to stay open. Some adapted by installing heavy curtains and running films in dim light, but audiences often listened as much to the sound of sirens as to the dialogue on screen. For children, evenings once filled with play outdoors were reduced to games in candlelight. The rhythm of life itself bent to the demands of war. The blackout wasn't simply a safety measure, it was a daily reminder that normality was suspended. Every plan, every routine, every decision was filtered through one unavoidable question: how do we survive the night? In rural areas, the blackout was less absolute but no less strange. Farmers who had once relied on moonlight to work at night now risked punishment for allowing lanterns to glow too freely. Isolated cottages, far from city centers, were still required to shroud their windows, as pilots flying overhead could use even a lone light to orient themselves. Villages that had once been lively with evening gatherings became eerily quiet. For some, the silence and darkness brought unexpected peace, a return to older rhythms of life before electricity. But for most, it carried unease. Even in the countryside, the war felt omnipresent, pressing into barns, fields, and lonely roads. The blackout reached beyond city streets, stretched into every corner of civilian existence, reminding farmers, shopkeepers, and children alike that no place, however remote, was untouched by the global conflict. For young people, the blackout created a world of contrasts. Some children treated it like an adventure, whispering ghost stories by torchlight or pretending to be spies in the dark. Teenagers sometimes saw the cover of night as an opportunity to sneak away from home or meet in secret. Yet innocence collided constantly with danger. Parents warned their children not to stray too far, fearful of accidents or raids. Schools introduced blackout drills, teaching students how to cover windows or find safety quickly. Over time, even games became colored by war. Children played at being wardens or pilots, turning survival into play. The blackout shaped their imaginations as much as it shaped their fears. For an entire generation, childhood was no longer defined by light, but by the shadows of war, where the darkness outside seeped deeply into the way they grew up. The blackout also became fertile ground for crime. Thieves and looters exploited the cover of darkness, breaking into shops or homes under the veil of night. Police forces, already stretched thin by war duties, struggled to patrol unlit streets. Reports of assaults, robberies, and smuggling increased, especially in large cities where fear made people reluctant to leave their homes. For women, the blackout added another layer of danger. Walking alone in unlit streets invited risks far beyond bombings. Authorities introduced stricter curfews, but enforcement was difficult. Criminals, like civilians, adapted quickly to the new reality. The blackout had been designed to defend against an external enemy, but it also created vulnerabilities from within, revealed the darker side of society where desperation, poverty, and opportunity collided in the absence of light. Civilians soon realized that survival meant not only hiding from bombs, but also from those who lurked in the shadows. Despite these dangers, many found humor in blackout life. Newspapers published cartoons of drivers crashing into lampposts or wardens scolding careless homeowners. People joked about walking into strangers in the dark or mistaking neighbors for intruders. Humor became a coping mechanism, a way to dull the edge of fear. Blackout mishaps turned into stories retold over tea, reminders that even in war, laughter could survive. Soldiers on leave teased civilians about their stumbling in the dark, while children giggled at the clumsy authority of wardens. This humor did not erase the danger, but it lightened the burden. It gave civilians a sense of control over circumstances they couldn't change. The blackout forced people to live with fear every night, but through humor, they could reclaim a sliver of normality. Laughter in the dark became one of the most human acts of resistance against the crushing weight of war. Technology adapted too. Cars were fitted with hooded headlights, narrow slits of light that barely illuminated the road. Factories created blackout lamps dim enough to conceal from the air, yet bright enough to allow limited work. Shops sold heavy curtains, adhesive tapes, and even blackout paint. Citizens became amateur engineers, rigging homemade solutions to keep light contained. Some crafted double-layered curtains, while others designed removable panels for windows. In wealthier homes, specially made blackout blinds became standard. The war drove innovation at every level, but most solutions were crude, improvised, and often frustrating. The blackout was not elegant. It was practical, born of necessity. It reminded civilians that in wartime, comfort gave way to survival. Every gadget, every improvised tool became part of the civilian arsenal. The blackout was not just an order from above, it was a nightly invention, crafted by millions of hands desperate to remain unseen. Religion also found a place in blackout culture. Many communities, churches held services by candlelight, with blackened windows shielding their congregations from outside view. Hymns echoed softly through darkened halls, offering solace against the roar of distant plains. For believers, the blackout became a spiritual test darkness as both literal and symbolic trial. Sermons spoke of endurance, of light hidden but never extinguished. Families prayed together before sealing their windows, seeking strength to endure the long night. Even those less devout often found comfort in ritual, the act of gathering, of whispering prayers or singing hymns in shadow. Religion did not stop bombs from falling, but it gave civilians something to hold on to, reminder that beyond the darkness, there was still hope. In this way, faith became another weapon of endurance, helping communities survive nights that seemed endless and suffocating. As the war dragged on, blackout life became routine. What had once been strange and terrifying settled into the rhythm of everyday existence. People no longer questioned the sealing of windows or the stumbling through unlit streets. It was simply how life worked. Diaries from the time reveal a chilling normality. Civilians recorded their days as if covering windows or navigating blind was as ordinary as cooking dinner. The human ability to adapt is remarkable, and in the blackout, this adaptation was both strength and tragedy. It showed resilience, but also resignation. Darkness had become normal, a fact of life as unshakable as rationing or sirens. Civilians lived not for comfort, but for survival. The war had rewritten what it meant to live, and the blackout was its signature: ordinary people learning to accept a world where night itself was the enemy. The blackout was never absolute, and its failures revealed the fragility of civilian defenses. Fires from bombing raids lit entire neighborhoods, undoing hours of preparation in seconds. Even a single careless light could draw enemy attention, undoing the sacrifice of thousands. Yet despite its flaws, the blackout endured as a symbol of collective effort. It showed that survival was not just about armies or governments, it was about ordinary people willing to live in discomfort to protect each other. The blackout was imperfect, sometimes deadly, and often suffocating. But it was also proof of determination, a shared act of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Every night that families endured the darkness, they sent a message to the skies. You may bomb our cities, but you will not find us easily. The blackout turned fear into resistance and survival into an act of quiet courage. Across Europe, blackout culture left lasting marks on memory. In Germany, civilians remembered how entire neighborhoods vanished into silence, even while propaganda urged them to remain strong. In France, people recalled stumbling through cobblestone streets so dark they had to feel the walls with their hands. In Britain, diaries tell of laughter and despair, of neighbors helping each other when lanterns failed. The blackout was not just a policy, it was an experience shared across nations, transcending borders and politics, Civilians everywhere faced the same challenge: to erase themselves from sight in order to survive. That shared hardship became part of a collective identity. Years later, survivors would describe the silence, the stumbling, the suffocating dark with vivid detail. It was a memory that defined the civilian side of the war, uniting people who, though enemies on the battlefield, lived the same nightly ritual of fear. In America, the blackout reached coastal cities after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York all enforced blackout drills, fearing Japanese or German bombers might cross the oceans. Though no large-scale attacks came, the darkness reminded Americans that war was no longer distant. Families covered windows, cars dimmed headlights, and communities held drills much like their counterparts overseas. For many Americans, it was the first time the global conflict touched their daily lives. The blackout also fueled rumors and paranoia. People reported suspicious lights, fearing spies or saboteurs might be signaling to enemy submarines. While the American blackout was temporary and far less intense than in Europe, it left an impression. It showed that even across the Atlantic, no place was immune to the shadow of war. Darkness had become the common language of fear, binding continents together under the same uneasy silence. The blackout was not only a defensive tactic, it also shaped how history was lived and recorded. Photographs of the time show cities in complete darkness, their skylines erased, their streets invisible. Writers described the surreal silence, the eerie glow of fires after raids, the claustrophobic feeling of being sealed in. Artists captured the mood in sketches and paintings, dark canvases punctuated by flashes of light. The blackout became a cultural memory as much as a practical measure. It defined how civilians thought of the war, not in battles or victories, but in shadows and survival. Diaries and letters are filled with accounts of checking curtains, of stumbling home, of listening to sirens in suffocating dark. These small details, repeated across millions of homes, became the fabric of wartime life. The blackout ensured that when civilians remembered the war, they remembered not only bombs, but the darkness that surrounded them. For the elderly, the blackout was especially brutal. Navigating unlit streets was treacherous, and accidents claimed many lives. Families often assigned younger members to escort grandparents or neighbors home after dark. Shelters, too, posed challenges with steep stairs and crowded conditions. Yet older generations often provided a kind of moral anchor. Many had survived World War I, and their calm reassured younger relatives. In diaries, children recall grandparents telling stories in the shelter, their voices steady even as bombs shook the ground. The blackout may have robbed them of safety, but it also highlighted resilience across generations. The elderly, who had seen the world change dramatically over their lifetimes, the blackout became one more chapter of endurance. Their presence reminded families that survival was possible even in darkness, and that courage sometimes came not from strength, but from the quiet example of having endured before. Women bore much of the burden of blackout life. While men were often away fighting, mothers and daughters became guardians of the home. They checked windows, prepared shelters, and comforted children during raids. Many worked in factories by day, only to return at night to the endless labor of survival. The blackout demanded vigilance, and women carried that responsibility with determination. They balanced fear with practicality, turning survival into routine. Some wrote later that the blackout was both their greatest challenge and their greatest lesson, that they could endure, that their strength mattered. For women across Europe, the war blurred lines between traditional roles. They became both protectors and providers, adapting to a world where even the simple act of lighting a lamp could be dangerous. The blackout made heroes not only of soldiers but of the countless women who fought a quieter, tireless battle every single night. Blackout culture also reached into the arts and media. Radio broadcasts, a vital lifeline during the war, often reminded listeners of blackout rules between programs. Newspapers carried headlines about fines for violations or praised neighborhoods that enforced rules strictly. Poets and writers used the imagery of darkness to symbolize fear, resilience, and unity. Films produced during the war included scenes of shadowed streets and hidden lights, embedding the blackout into cultural memory. Even after the war ended, the imagery remained powerful. Plays, novels, and later television dramas often used the blackout as a setting for suspense, romance, or tragedy. It became shorthand for the civilian experience of the war, reminder of the silence, the secrecy, and the vulnerability of those who lived beneath the bombs. In this way, the blackout outlived its practical use, transforming into a lasting symbol of endurance and survival in the cultural imagination. But the blackout was not without critics. Some argued it caused more harm than good, pointing to rising accident rates and the psychological toll of nightly fear. Others claimed the effectiveness was overstated, since bombers could use rivers, coastlines, or moonlight to find their way. Military strategists debated its value, yet governments insisted on its necessity. For civilians, the argument was irrelevant. They had no choice. They lived the blackout because it was law, because wardens knocked at their doors, because fear left them no alternative. Whether or not it truly saved lives, the blackout defined how civilians experienced the war. Impact was less about strategy and more about daily life. Critics may have doubted its military worth, but for ordinary people, it was the war itself lived, every evening in silence and shadow, whether it saved them or not. When the war finally ended, the return of light was a profound moment. In London, Paris, and countless other cities, street lamps glowed again after years of darkness. Crowds gathered to watch as electricity poured life back into streets long shrouded in shadow. For many, the first sight of lit windows felt almost surreal. Children who had grown up under blackout rules saw light at night for the very first time. Celebrations erupted, but so too did reflection. The return of light marked not just victory, but the end of a way of life that had shaped millions. Civilians realized how deeply the blackout had defined them, how the absence of something so ordinary, light, had changed their sense of safety, freedom, and community. The glow of lamps was more than brightness. It was a symbol that fear no longer ruled the night. Yet even after the lights returned, the habits of blackout life lingered. Many people continued to check their curtains at night, a reflex born of years of vigilance. Some found it difficult to sleep in brightly lit rooms, preferring the comfort of darkness. Stories of stumbling through unlit streets or huddling in shelters became part of family lore, passed from parents to children. The blackout etched itself into the collective psyche. For survivors, it was impossible to separate memories of the war from memories of the darkness. It wasn't just a chapter of history, it was a lived experience that shaped behavior long after peace returned. The war had ended, but the blackout left behind shadows that persisted in memory, a reminder of how profoundly war changes not only nations, but the smallest routines of ordinary life. The legacy of the blackout extends beyond memory. Modern civil defense strategies, from blackout drills during the Cold War to energy conservation, blackouts today, borrow language and lessons from World War II. The idea that light can be dangerous, that darkness can save lives, comes directly from the experience of millions of civilians. In this sense, the blackout was not just a wartime measure, but a blueprint for survival in future crises. Historians note that it was one of the first times entire nations mobilized civilians on such a massive scale. It showed that survival depended not only on armies, but on ordinary people changing their lives completely for the sake of defense. The blackout was both an innovation and a burden, but its influence lived on, shaping how nations prepare for threats even decades after the last wartime lamps were lit again. For children who grew up during the blackout, memories remained vivid throughout their lives. Many described the fear of sirens, the comfort of family huddled together, and the strange beauty of starlit skies unpolluted by city lights. Some recalled how darkness made them imaginative, turning shadows into monsters or heroes. Others remembered it as suffocating, a time when childhood was consumed by fear. Psychologists later studied this generation, noting how the blackout shaped resilience but also anxiety. For many, it was their earliest memory of the war. Long after battles and politics faded, the image of sealed curtains and pitch-black streets endured. Childhood had been rewritten by war, defined not by play and light but by survival in the shadows. The blackout became their defining inheritance, a reminder of how even the youngest were forced to grow up in the darkness of global conflict. The blackout also left physical scars on cities. Paint stripped from windows, curtains worn thin, and improvised devices became relics of wartime life. Museums preserved blackout blinds, hooded lamps, and even warning posters as artifacts of resilience. Some buildings still bore traces of blackout paint years later, a haunting reminder of nights lived in silence. Urban planners noted how cities changed new systems of lighting, new safety measures, all influenced by the wartime experience. The blackout had reshaped not only habits but infrastructure. In some cases, it even inspired post-war innovation as cities sought ways to balance light with safety. The material remains of the blackout stood as testimony to a strange period when darkness was law, and every household became part of the war effort. These scars, both physical and emotional, ensured the blackout would never be forgotten. One of the most striking features of blackout life was how quickly people normalized the unnatural. Within weeks, stumbling through pitch-black streets, taping windows, and whispering in the dark felt ordinary. This adaptation reveals both the strength and fragility of human nature. People can survive remarkable conditions, but in doing so, they risk accepting fear as routine. Historians often note that the blackout blurred the line between defense and control. Civilians weren't just protecting themselves, they were being conditioned, taught to obey, to endure. The war turned entire nations into silent participants in a nightly ritual of survival. That normalization was both a triumph of resilience and a reminder of how profoundly war can reshape even the simplest aspects of human existence. The blackout was no longer extraordinary, it was simply life. And that, perhaps, was its most haunting effect of all. Letters from soldiers often mentioned the blackout back home. Men at the front wrote to wives and mothers, reminding them to check curtains, asking about shelters or joking about the clumsy accidents of neighbors. For soldiers, the blackout symbolized both the vulnerability of their families and their determination to endure. They fought battles abroad, while their loved ones fought nightly battles of their own. These letters reveal a striking truth. The blackout connected front lines to home fronts. It wasn't just soldiers who were part of the war effort. Civilians, through silence and darkness, shared the burden. The blackout became a common ground between those in trenches and those in kitchens, a reminder that survival required sacrifice on every side. In these exchanges, the blackout emerged as a powerful symbol of unity between those who fought with weapons and those who fought with shadows. In some places, the blackout sparked creativity in unexpected ways. Writers used the silence to work undisturbed, crafting poems or stories by candlelight. Musicians composed in the dark, their notes shaped by the eerie atmosphere. Couples met in shadowed streets, where secrecy added to romance. For some, the blackout offered rare beauty, skies glittering with stars unseen for centuries, a natural wonder revealed only when cities surrendered their lights. These small sparks of creativity and wonder did not erase the fear, but they gave meaning to it. Civilians discovered that even in enforced darkness, life could continue, love could flourish, art could survive. The blackout showed that war could strip away comfort, but it could not extinguish the human spirit. Out of the shadows came not only fear, but also resilience, creativity, and moments of beauty no one had expected. Still, not everyone endured. For some, the blackout was unbearable. The silence and suffocation triggered anxiety, depression, even breakdowns. Hospitals treated patients whose nerves collapsed under the strain of nightly fear. Children developed sleep disorders, adults drank heavily to cope, and communities mourned. Not only those killed by bombs, but also those broken by the darkness itself. The blackout revealed the limits of resilience. People could adapt, but not without cost. Behind the statistics of survival were untold stories of psychological toll. Civilians paid a price that often went unnoticed, overshadowed by battles and strategies. The blackout was not just about protecting bodies, it was about testing minds. And for many, the weight of that test left wounds as lasting as any physical scar of war. As peace returned, the memory of blackout nights became a measure of survival. Veterans spoke of battles, but civilians spoke of silence, of stumbling, of fear in the dark.
Out!
The blackout was their war story, their battlefield. It symbolized the endurance of ordinary people, those without uniforms or medals, who nonetheless played a crucial role in survival. They had no rifles, no trenches, but their discipline mattered just as much. Governments recognized this, later honoring the civilian role in wartime defense. Yet for many, recognition was unnecessary. They knew what they had endured, and they carried that memory quietly in family stories and personal recollections. The blackout became the emblem of the civilian contribution to victory and invisible war, fought every night with curtains, candles, and courage. Looking back, historians argue that the blackout represented one of the most profound shifts in civilian life during the war. It showed that survival was collective, that ordinary routines could become instruments of defense. It blurred the boundaries between soldiers and civilians, between battlefield and home front. In that sense, the blackout was more than policy. It was a symbol of total war, where everyone, regardless of age or role, became part of the struggle. It reshaped culture, memory, and even identity. The war ended, but the lesson endured. In times of crisis, even the smallest sacrifices, covering a window, walking in darkness, can carry immense weight. The blackout was both terrifying and unifying, a reminder that in the greatest conflicts of history, survival often depends not only on armies, but on the quiet resilience of millions of ordinary people. Today, the blackout remains one of the most haunting symbols of World War II. Museums preserve the artifacts, films recreate the atmosphere, and survivors continue to tell their stories. It has become part of the cultural imagination, used to evoke fear, resilience, unity, in countless works of history and art. For younger generations, it may seem distant, a strange relic of another time. But the stories of those who lived it bring the darkness to life, reminding us that the war was not only fought with tanks and planes, but with silence and patience. The blackout endures as a lesson in endurance, a warning of vulnerability, and a testament to courage. It is history written not in battles, but in shadows. The war is long over, but the memory of blackout nights remains. They remind us that history is not only shaped by generals and soldiers, but by families who covered their windows, stumbled through unlit streets, and endured fear with quiet determination. The blackout was more than a strategy, it was a way of life, lived by millions night after night. It turned ordinary homes into fortresses, neighbors into allies, and darkness into a weapon of survival. In remembering the blackout, we honor not just the victories of armies, but the resilience of civilians who fought their own war in silence and shadow. For in the end, the blackout was not only about darkness, it was about the light within people, their courage, their endurance, their refusal to surrender, even when the world around them was consumed by night.